Welcome back to Conflicts of Interest. This is episode 448. I'm the host, Kyle Anzalone, today joined by co-host Connor Freeman. Connor, how you doing today?
I'm doing great, Cal. How are you doing?
Doing very well. Happy to have you back on the show. And we have to open today by talking about our great institute, the Libertarian Institute, which of course was founded by Scott Horton. And right now, this week, we are holding a fundraiser looking to make sure we could pay the staff to keep doing and putting out all the great content that we're putting out. Since we've done the last fundraiser, we've added a lot of great writers to our staff, including Ted Snyder and Ted Galen Carpenter, who this isn't because they work at the Libertarian Institute. I've been saying it long before then that, since Russia has invaded Ukraine, have been the two most important writers on the foreign policy issue. Guaranteed, just so brilliant. And so, Ted Carpenter was, actually fired from the Cato Institute in part because he was so good on this issue. And, when he had an opportunity to write more articles, Scott Horton jumped in and said, come on board our institute. So help us make sure that we could continue to pay great writers like Ted Carpenter, put out shows like Conflicts of Interest, the Scott Horton Show, Keith Knight's great show, Don't Tread on Anyone, and a whole bunch of other great content that we have at the Institute, including a new book by Lori Calhoun. I believe Connor has his copy with him today. If you want to hold that up real quick, and if you make a donation to the Institute, I believe you could get a free copy of Lori's book. So if you want to question the COVID company line, check out Lori's book. And Connor, with that, let's get into today's show. The first thing up I have to talk about today is Russia issues warning over Black Sea ships heading into Ukraine. And this was a pretty bold statement by the Russian Defense Ministry. They said, given the Black Sea Initiative has come to an end, the maritime humanitarian corridor has been terminated. All ships going across the Black Sea to Ukrainian ports will be considered potential carriers of military purpose cargo. So, Connor, that could obviously mean that Russia's just going to start firing on all civilian ships. It could also mean that they are, going to carry out more inspections or, maybe not even do anything here. So we'll see how this ends up playing out, but it is a pretty significant threat, I think, from the Kremlin about what's going to happen in the Black Sea. Now, Russia canceled the Black Sea deal, of course, earlier this week after the Kerch Bridge was hit with I believe, a water-based, like a sea, drone, and was damaged, although not super significantly. Russia has carried out more and more strikes on Ukraine in response, but I'm not quite sure if the grain deal was canceled because of that attack or was canceled because of Russia's longstanding grievances with it, mainly stemming from the Western sanctions on Russia, preventing Russia from obtaining any benefits from the grain deal. All right, Connor, the one other story I have on Ukraine today is this. U.S. announces $1.3 billion weapons package for Kiev. Now, as we talked about on the last show, this is a Ukraine Security Assistance Initiative package, which means these arms are going to be purchased from manufacturers. And so maybe they even have to be made before they could be sent to Ukraine. It could take months or years before they get there. But as always, I just want to run through quickly what is in this package. For National Advanced Surface-to-Air Missile Systems, 152 millimeter artillery rounds, mine clearing equipment, tube-launched, optically tracked, wire-guided tow missiles, Phoenix Ghost and Switchblade unmanned aerial drones, precision aerial munitions, counter UAS and electronic warfare detection equipment, 150 fuel trucks, 115 tactical vehicles to tow and haul equipment, 50 tactical vehicles to recover equipment, port and harbor security equipment, tactical secure communication systems, and support for training, maintenance, and sustainment activities. So, Connor, this is, I think, in total about $18 billion since the start of the war that the U.S. has sent Ukraine in arms through the USAI, which by my estimate means that they should be running out of that kind of aid soon to send Ukraine. And so they'll likely be coming to Congress asking for more funds. All right, with that, let me turn over to Connor to talk about North Korea.
Yeah, absolutely. So this is a piece I wrote for the Institute on July 10th. North Korea warns it may shoot down American spy planes. So Pyongyang has accused the U.S. military of conducting provocative surveillance flights, which infringe on its airspace and trespass in its exclusive economic zone on Monday. The Democratic People's Republic of Korea, the DPRK, admonished Washington that if such provocations persist, American reconnaissance planes may be shot down. So, of course, this comes amid soaring tensions on the Korean Peninsula, largely as a result of these massive joint U.S. South Korean war games, which have seen the White House deploy aircraft carriers, nuclear capable bombers, and armed Reaper drones. Kim Yo Jong, the sister of DPRK leader Kim Jong Un, as well as one of his top foreign policy officials, has said that North Korean warplanes scrambled to intercept a U.S. spy plane flying in Pyongyang's exclusive economic zone where it controls natural resources. And this includes the area within 200 nautical miles of its territory. And she insisted that there were 8 such intrusions on the, let's see, so this would have been on Monday, the day that I wrote the piece. I just want to make sure that I'm getting the timing right here since we're a few days later. So denouncing the intensifying sorties by the American aircraft as encroaching on her country's sovereignty, Kim issued a warning that American forces would experience a very critical fight if these aggressive actions continue. A shocking incident would occur in the long run in the 20 to 40 kilometer section in which the U.S. spy planes habitually intrude into the skies above the economic water zone of the DPRK, she declared. And just the conversion there for everyone is 12 to 25 nautical miles. Now, South Korea's Joint Chiefs of Staff denied that Washington was flying spy planes into North Korean territory, with a spokesperson explaining the U.S. is instead in the areas surrounding the peninsula, quote, conducting standard reconnaissance activities. And in response, Kim fired back saying that the Joint Chiefs of Staff is acting as if they're the Pentagon's spokesman. Now, an earlier statement, there is a bit of a discrepancy here because an earlier statement by the North Korean Defense Ministry had stated that the U.S. was in fact flying its reconnaissance planes within the country's, as they put it, inviolable airspace. And that would extend 12 nautical miles from the coast of the DPRK per international law. And the ministry also charged that American actions were raising the risk of nuclear conflict on the peninsula, pointing to the White House's pledge that Washington will periodically dock nuclear-armed ballistic missile submarines in South Korea. This is a pledge Biden made to President Yoon of South Korea last April when Yoon visited D.C. The Defense Ministry also cited the ongoing presence of American spy planes and drones. They said there is no guarantee that such a shocking accident as the downing of the U.S. Air Force Strategic Reconnaissance plane will not happen. And so they're alerting as to the risks here. And then the Pentagon dismissed Pyongyang's allegations in stern words, with spokesperson Sabrina Singh saying, so those accusations are just accusations. And then we had State Department spokesperson Matthew Miller imploring the DPRK to, quote, refrain from escalatory actions and emphasize that the DPRK should engage in serious and sustained diplomacy. Apparently, Miller had previously told a news briefing that Washington is willing to talk with Pyongyang without preconditions. Of course, painting the DPRK as recalcitrant. They offer the same script with China, actually, nowadays. They offer no concessions, but we would love to talk. So they always want to paint sort of the country in the crosshairs of the empire as being the real obstinate party here. Now, North Korean state media described the U.S. sending nuclear assets to the peninsula as, quote, the most undisguised nuclear blackmail against Pyongyang as well as its neighbors. Last month, an American B-52 strategic bomber participated in joint air military drills with Seoul. Now, after a multi-year pause, President Joe Biden's administration has resumed large-scale war games targeting the DPRK. And consequently, since 2022, Pyongyang has launched more than 100 missiles. In March, Washington and Seoul carried out their largest live-fire field exercises in 5 years. The drills were dubbed Faux Eagle. Now, concurrently, for the first time, the Pentagon, as I mentioned earlier, the drones, they sent MQ-9 Reaper armed drones for the first time to the Korean Peninsula. And as part of the giant military exercises this year, Washington and Seoul more recently carried out the largest war drills in the history of their 7-decade alliance. And some of these drills took place provocatively close to the border with the demilitarized zone, the DMZ. Now, last year, Washington, Tokyo, and Seoul entered a trilateral defense agreement eyeing Pyongyang and Beijing. And at the time, North Korea had referred to this pact as an Asian version of NATO. We'll track this down and see what, if anything, came of this. But this was still on the eve of the Vilnius summit, which began the day after I wrote this piece. But it was noted in reports that in Vilnius, Yoon Suk-yeol, the president of South Korea, was to be attending the NATO summit, and that his office was explaining that he was going to be attempting to more deeply involve the North Atlantic Alliance in countering the alleged North Korean nuclear threat. And so I point out that, however, in June, it was revealed that the U.S. intelligence community has concluded Pyongyang will continue to use its nuclear weapons status only as a way of coercively accomplishing some political and diplomatic objectives, not for offensive military purposes. Now, compared with Donald Trump, President Biden has taken a vastly more bellicose policy regarding the DPRK. In the last half of the Trump administration, war games were rolled back, dialogue was open, and all sides reduced weapons tests. As crippling sanctions are imposed indefinitely, despite Miller's claim, Biden has offered Pyongyang no off-ramp. The administration is demanding that Kim agree to his country's denuclearization and disarmament. The current status quo has North Korea facing myriad regime change rehearsals on the DPRK's doorstep, while U.S. officials periodically threaten the country with obliteration, as they did again this week. And we'll get to that here in just a moment. So the follow-up piece here is on the 16th. I wrote this one for the Institute. This is U.S., South Korea, and Japan hold joint military exercises after North Korea's ICBM launch. So Washington, Seoul, and Tokyo held joint naval drills testing missile defenses in international waters between Japan and South Korea on Sunday. Following Pyongyang's latest intercontinental ballistic missile launch, an envoy for the Democratic People's Republic of Korea spoke before the UN Security Council days earlier. This hasn't happened in years. He defended his government's actions as a response to various military provocations by Washington and its allies. So South Korea's Navy portrayed Sunday's drills as an opportunity to improve security cooperation with Japan, as well as the United States, in the face of, quote, North Korea's nuclear and missile threats. The missile defense exercises saw the participation of American, South Korean, and Japanese destroyers equipped with Aegis radar systems. So on Wednesday, North Korea fired its latest Hwasong-18 missile, which Pyongyang claims to be the focal point of its nuclear strike force. And they fired it off its east coast as quote, a strong practical warning to the U.S., South Korea, and Japan. And so it's important to point out that there have been several war games carried out this year with the trilateral war games with Washington, Seoul, and Tokyo. Not as much as the joint U.S., South Korean war games, but still, it's very notable. And so after this ICBM test, North Korea's fourth launch this year, there was an emergency meeting of the UN Security Council that was held on Thursday. The U.S. Ambassador Jeffrey De Laurentiis, the acting deputy representative to the United Nations, read from a joint statement of 10 member governments censuring the DPRK's missile launch, quote, in the strongest possible terms. So reading from the statement, De Laurentiis declared, "We must send a clear and collective signal to the DPRK and all proliferators that this behavior is unlawful, destabilizing, and will not be normalized." However, on a yearly basis, Washington provides billions in military aid to apartheid Israel, which maintains a clandestine nuclear weapons program. And over the past decades, the U.S. government has spent hundreds of billions in taxpayer money supporting the Israeli government, although Tel Aviv's open secret nuclear arsenal, which is thought to contain hundreds of warheads, makes this bipartisan policy technically illegal per U.S. foreign assistance laws. So it seems like we are done a pretty good job ourselves of normalizing this kind of unlawful and destabilizing behavior. So last month, it was revealed. I just referenced the declassified national intelligence estimate that suggests that, that says that the intel community is convinced and they believe that Kim is not going to use his nuclear weapons for any offensive purposes. It's just he's using it as leverage for diplomacy to get sanctions lifted and to end these constant war games, among other things. Now, North Korea's envoy, and to back the United States off from its extremely hostile policy, which has only been escalated under Biden. There's not even a pretense of wanting to de-escalate at all, or have any kind of reasonable diplomacy. So North Korea's envoy Kim Song, the first DPRK representative to appear before the UN Security Council in 6 years, described Pyongyang's test fire this week as a necessary response to recent escalations by the hostile forces. He said, how can the deployment of nuclear assets, joint military exercises, and aerial espionage acts by the United States contribute to peace and stability on the Korean Peninsula, he asks. Pyongyang's envoy cited U.S. spy planes flying in the DPRK's exclusive economic zone, the docking in Busan of a nuclear-powered U.S. cruise missile submarine, as well as the upcoming deployment in South Korea of an American nuclear-armed ballistic missile submarine. That happened this week. And the White House deployed armed Reaper drones, aircraft carriers, and, as I said, these heavy bombers to the peninsula for all these war games this year. Now, despite criticism from De Laurentiis, Moscow and Beijing opposed any proposed actions by the Security Council and instead highlighted Washington's role as a destabilizer. So Zhang Jun, China's UN ambassador, said the U.S. and its allies remain, quote, obsessed with sanctions and pressure, which has caused the DPRK to face huge security threats and pressure to survive. Zhang implored Washington to propose practical solutions, take meaningful actions, and to respond to the legitimate concerns of the DPRK. And so again, when we're talking about these massive, these reconnaissance flights, this is another thing. I mean, we send nuclear assets to South Korea quite often now. And this is a major project that Lloyd Austin has been promoting throughout this year, and of course, Joe Biden as well. And this is only meant as a provocation. And so what it does is it raises tensions with North Korea unnecessarily, but they're right on China's border. So for all the tensions that are raised as a result of these massive war games, it's only making worsening our relations with China. And if you look at this, I am very fond of pointing out the massive uptick in reconnaissance flights and spy plane sorties under Biden, eyeing China in the East China Sea, the South China Sea, and the Yellow Sea, which were drastically expanded under the Joe Biden administration, even after the 2020, when the American military footprint in the Asia Pacific was heavily expanded by Donald Trump. But Joe Biden came in and just hit the accelerator and has not tapped the brake at all. And so, there are in 2021, there were 2,000 of those sorties, and they're often very close to China's coast. And just imagine what it would be like if the shoe was on the other foot and we had Chinese military spy planes in the Gulf of Mexico or buzzing near the Atlantic coast. We would probably our government would invoke the Monroe Doctrine and we would go to war. But we're supposed to assume that none of these countries have any right to any sphere of influence or any semblance of sovereignty comparable to what we demand from the rest of the world with respect to our territory, although we extend the Monroe Doctrine all the way to Taiwan or Ukraine. So anyway, so now here's the piece about the submarine, actually the nuclear-armed submarine being docked in Busan. This previous docking in Busan was described as a dress rehearsal for a sub that actually does have nuclear weapons and ballistic missiles on it. And this is from Dave DeCamp on the 18th. So U.S. nuclear-armed submarine docks in South Korea for the first time since 1981. So we have a U.S. nuclear-armed submarine docking in South Korea on Tuesday in a major provocation aimed at North Korea as tensions on the Korean Peninsula continue to rise. The docking of the USS Kentucky, an Ohio-class submarine in the South Korean port of Busan, marks the first time since 1981 that a U.S. nuclear-armed submarine arrived in the country. It also marks the first time U.S. nuclear weapons have been deployed to the Korean Peninsula since 1991, the year the U.S. withdrew all of the tactical nukes that it had stationed in South Korea. So because U.S. nuclear-armed submarines, can covertly patrol waters anywhere in the world and have long-range missiles, docking one in South Korea has no strategic value. Demonstrating the move is nothing more than a blatant provocation by the Biden administration. And the provocation is also likely meant to send a message to China. President Biden agreed to deploy a nuclear-armed submarine to South Korea in April when South Korean President Yoon Suk-yeol visited Washington. The two leaders also agreed to increase cooperation on nuclear deterrence and established a nuclear consultative group, which held its first meeting at the presidential office in Seoul on Tuesday. Protesters staged a rally against the nuclear consultative group in front of the presidential office. Demonstrators carried signs that read "Dismantle NCG" and opposition to the deployment of nuclear submarines. Now, the NCG meeting was led by South Korean Deputy National Security Director Kim Tae-ho and Kurt Campbell, President Biden's top Asia official on the National Security Council. And of course, he's the architect of the pivot to Asia, co-founder of Center for New American Security, one of the they have huge influence over the Biden administration. It's filled with China hawks, and they received more money in the last several years from arms industry giants than any other of these Beltway neoconservative or what have you, hawkish think tanks. And so he's the top Asia official on Biden's National Security Council, and he declared in 2021 that our era of engagement with China is over. And I'm sure he sees a strategical advantage here. As it relates to the larger buildup against China. And so he's leading this meeting. He said, let's see, I think they put out a statement after the meeting, and it says, any nuclear attack by North Korea against the United States or its allies is unacceptable and will result in the end of that regime. So talking about dropping nukes on North Korea. The submarine deployment and NCG meeting came a few days after North Korea launched a suspected intercontinental ballistic missile. Since early 2022, North Korea has conducted over 100 missile tests, and the U.S. have resumed these massive live-fire war games, pitting both sides in a series of tit-for-tat escalations. And as Dave says, the Biden administration has made no efforts to de-escalate the tensions on the peninsula or to pursue talks. Kim Yo-jong, again, the sister of Kim Jong-un, said Monday that the U.S. deployment of the nuclear-armed submarine would make diplomacy even less likely, and warned that the North was, quote, ready for resolutely countering any acts of violating its sovereignty. Okay, so this next story, we're moving into the Middle East. This is about, I'm sure people have been hearing that Biden has apparently said he's going to invite Benjamin Netanyahu to the United States. It's for a meeting soon. It's not exactly clear yet that whether that's going to take place at the. Netanyahu's national security advisor is saying it is in fact going to take place at the White House. But anything Biden says right now with relating to the judicial overhaul, I mean, it's all really silly. I mean, when he said, "Oh, this could jeopardize our special relationship with Israel," and Tom Friedman just wrote this piece up for the Times when he went and talked to Biden after Biden met with the Israeli president Isaac Herzog in the Oval Office. And Biden is, the idea is he's making his policy and how he feels about this political chaos that has been caused by Netanyahu's coalition's controversial judicial overhaul. And Netanyahu, they actually say in the article, Tom Friedman says it's very dire. Biden could be the last pro-Israel president in the United States. And it's just such a lot of hype over absolutely nothing. And that's really the point of this article, is to highlight how these concerns that, Biden hadn't invited Netanyahu since he came to power last December. And what does this mean for the U.S.-Israeli relationship? We're seeing look up your congressman or your senator, and I'm sure they put out some tweet or some speech this week saying, I support Israel unconditionally. It's very, the lobby and however it's being communicated, it's being hyped that everybody needs to show that they, love our 51st state. So, okay, so this piece is called Biden Invites Netanyahu to Meet Soon in the U.S. as Israel has killed nearly 200 Palestinians in 2023. So, and this is from the 17th. So President Joe Biden invited Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu to, quote, meet soon in the United States during a phone call on Monday. Now, this comes as Tel Aviv is escalating its military attacks and bombings against neighboring countries, the blockaded Gaza Strip, as well as the Palestinians living in the occupied West Bank. So relations between the White House and the Israelis appeared strained as a result of controversies related to the Netanyahu coalition's planned judicial overhaul, which has caused political chaos. Biden and Netanyahu have not spoken for 7 months since his coalition took power last December. In a recent interview with CNN, Biden remarked that the ruling coalition, which includes these ultra-nationalist settlers like Bezalel Smotrich and Itamar Ben-Gvir, is, quote, extreme. Now, during that time, however, there has been no waning in Washington's, quote, ironclad support for Tel Aviv's violence against the Palestinians, Israel's various threats to attack the Iranians, and its constant airstrikes in Syria, which are largely coordinated with the Pentagon and have doubled since Netanyahu took office. So, in a statement from Netanyahu's office, the call was described as long and warm. The statement continued, saying this conversation focused on bolstering the strong bond between the nations, thwarting threats from Iran and its proxies, expanding the circle of peace, and continued efforts to de-escalate and stabilize the situation in the West Bank. And so we take part all of these different claims. So last year, Biden, who has been known as Israel's man in Washington for decades, declared that ties with Tel Aviv are bone deep. Biden's proclamation followed the murder of an American journalist named Shireen Abu Akleh at the hands of an Israeli apartheid army sniper. The Al Jazeera reporter was covering an IDF raid on the Jenin refugee camp in the West Bank while wearing a press vest when she was shot in the head and killed. She was actually shot in the face. And the fake Iranian nuclear threat, we're talking about how we're going to thwart threats from Iran and its proxies. So the fake Iranian nuclear threat has long been exploited by the Israelis as a way of maintaining its massive military aid courtesy of the U.S. taxpayer. According to the Pentagon, as well as U.S. intelligence, including the CIA, the Islamic Republic is not seeking nuclear weapons. Additionally, Tehran has been a signatory of the Non-Proliferation Treaty for more than half a century. Israel, of course, is not a signatory to the Non-Proliferation Treaty because they maintain, as we talked about earlier, this clandestine, open secret nuclear weapons arsenal. Now, this technically makes all of our aid, as I said, this financial and military aid over the years, which amounts to hundreds of billions, illegal since the 1970s, per the Glenn Symington amendments to the foreign assistance laws. Now, during the Biden administration, Israel has carried out myriad attacks inside Iran, including sabotage against the country's civilian nuclear energy program, as well as assassinations and drone strikes. Iranian oil tankers have also been routinely targeted by Tel Aviv as well, along with cargo ships. Now, expanding the circle of peace almost certainly refers to the Abraham Accords, which involve Arab countries not in any conflict with Israel, quote, normalizing their relations with Tel Aviv. The Gulf state signatories do this in exchange for American weapons as the Israelis continue building illegal Jewish-only colonies in the West Bank and bombing Gaza. Both the U.S. and the Israelis hope to use the Abraham Accords as a foundation for a NATO-style alliance aimed at Iran. Although earlier this year, Riyadh restored full diplomatic relations with Tehran in a deal brokered by China, and this has sparked a realignment in the region, which has likely rendered their plan, the American-Israeli plan, as untenable. Now, Israel's military and its settlers have murdered nearly 200 Palestinians this year. Although in May, the Israelis launched a major bombing campaign against Gaza, killing 33 people in the open-air concentration camp, the casualties this year have occurred mostly in the West Bank. This month, with the support of the White House, Israel invaded and bombed Jenin, killing a dozen people, including 5 children. Israeli bulldozers tore up the camp's roads, electricity, and water networks. 1,000 troops participated in the raid, along with fighter jets, Apache helicopters, drones, and 150 armored vehicles. And this was all done with the complete endorsement of the American administration. So there is absolutely no concern and all these crocodile tears about the relationship between Biden and Netanyahu. It is exactly that. It's just they do not care about, they 100% support Israel's foreign policy. In fact, as Trita Parsi has pointed out, and it's so important, I think that the Biden administration has received this green light from, or excuse me, the Israelis have received this green light from the Biden administration that they can go ahead and attack Iran anytime they want. And that we support it. Whatever you want to do, like as Tom Nides, the ambassador to Israel, has said, whatever you feel like you have to do with regards to Iran, you have our full support. And Jake Sullivan has said much the same thing, speaking to the Washington Institute for Near East Policy recently, I think in May. And it's just been it's unprecedented. I mean, Trita's written a few articles showing that this is far more hawkish than anything that Donald Trump or Barack Obama or even George W. Bush did with regards to giving Israel this thumbs up to go ahead and attack Iran. And because, of course, it would cause a massive war that would probably absolutely dwarf very quickly the consequences and ramifications of the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq. I mean, it's absolutely insane. This is a country of 80 million people. Everyone knows they don't have nuclear weapons, and they are constantly being attacked by the Israelis, and they don't really do all that much to counter it. And Israel has bombed Lebanon this year. They've bombed, of course, the horrible bombing campaign mentioned earlier in Gaza. And the settlements are just being expanded at an alarming rate. I mean, they're setting records for how many so-called construction projects, which are all illegal in the occupied territories, have been endorsed. There's a new report out by a peace group showing that they're breaking all kinds of records for settlement expansion. Or what's being approved and what's being planned. So this is, it's just ridiculous to even pretend that there's going to be any kind of a beef here with Washington and Tel Aviv. They can essentially do whatever they want, and then we just have to fund it. But we'll get more into that, the politics of all this next week. Now, hey, Kyle, are we recording? This next story, this is about Syria. So this is from Dave DeCamp on July 18th. 2 Syrian soldiers wounded in Israeli airstrikes on Damascus. So Israel is continuing its constant bombing of Syria. We have Israeli airstrikes targeting Damascus early Wednesday morning, wounding 2 Syrian soldiers. Syrian media has reported. So Sana'a, the Syrian state news agency, reported that at about 12:25 a.m., the Israeli enemy carried out an air aggression with bursts of missiles from the direction of the north of the occupied Syrian Golan, targeting some points in the vicinity of Damascus. And this is courtesy of a military source speaking to the outlet. Our air defenses intercepted the aggression's missiles and shot down most of them, the source said, adding that besides the 2 injured soldiers, some material damage was reported. Now, Israel has not yet commented on this bombing, but rarely acknowledges individual airstrikes in Syria. Israeli officials frame their operations in Syria as, attacks against Iran and Hezbollah, but they're frequently killing or injuring Syrians or attempting to destroy their civilian infrastructure. And as we've seen with the airport bombings, especially over the last several months. And the incident marks at least the 20th Israeli bombing of Syria this year. In May, Israeli Defense Minister Yoav Gallant said that the Israeli government of Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has doubled the airstrikes in Syria since they came to power in December. Okay, so now we have another U.S. intelligence report confirming that Iran is not seeking nuclear weapons. This is from Dave DeCamp on July 11th. So a new U.S. intelligence report has reaffirmed that Iran is not trying to build nuclear weapons, despite the constant claims made by Israel and Western media outlets to the contrary. So this is an unclassified summary of a report from the Office of the Director of National Intelligence, Avril Haines. It says Iran is not currently undertaking the key nuclear weapons development activities that would be necessary to produce a testable nuclear device. The report noted that Iran has taken steps to increase uranium enrichment, which it called, quote, research and development activities that would bring it closer to producing the fission material needed for completing a nuclear device following a decision to do so. But as Dave explains, Iran has been enriching some uranium at 60%, a step it took in 2021 in response to an Israeli attack on the Natanz nuclear facility. But 90% enrichment is needed for weapons grade, and there's no sign that Tehran is looking to bring enrichment to that level. Now, the DNI report says that Iran was enriching uranium beyond the limits imposed by the 2015 nuclear deal known as the JCPOA. But those limits are irrelevant since the U.S. withdrew from the agreement in 2018 by reimposing sanctions, making Tehran no longer bound by the deal, which restricted uranium enrichment at 3.67%. And last year, the Pentagon's Nuclear Posture Review also concluded that Iran was not developing nuclear weapons. Iran does not today possess a nuclear weapon, and we currently believe it is not pursuing one, the Nuclear Posture Review read. So Israel has been threatening to attack Iran over its nuclear program, but recently the government of Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has toned down its rhetoric on the issue amid reports that the U.S. and Iran are holding these indirect negotiations. So Saki Hanegbi, Netanyahu's national security advisor, said on June 30th that Israel wasn't getting any closer to bombing Iran because, quote, the Iranians have stopped for a while now. They are not enriching uranium to that level. That is, in our view, that is the red line. So, yeah, so it's interesting. I mean, we'll have to see if anything really comes ultimately of this, the negotiations that have been being held for this interim deal. It'll be interesting to see. Robert Malley has had to leave his post because of he was allegedly improperly handling classified materials. But the Middle East Eye report that really first broke this story about the talks indicated that he was meeting with Iran's UN ambassador on U.S. soil, and these talks were related to this interim deal where potentially Iran would be, quote, permitted to export 1 million barrels of oil per day and also receive somewhere around like $20 billion worth of assets that have previously been frozen that are currently held in South Korea, Iraq, and the International Monetary Fund. And really, it doesn't appear to me from any of the reports that I've read that Iran has to do much at all in order to get this deal through. It's really what the American side has to do because they want them to maintain a productive, transparent relationship with the IAEA, which they have been. Many of these outstanding inquiries we've been talking about for even just the last couple of years have, at least two big ones, have been resolved recently in the last couple of months. And, the other thing that they said was they don't want them to increase enrichment beyond 60%. But as Dave pointed out, there's no indication that they plan to do that. Not only that, the Iranian Nuclear Energy Organization, I forget exactly the full name of the Atomic Energy Organization of that particular department of their government, but they made a pledge in 2021 that even though they have increased the enrichment of uranium hexafluoride to 60%, they do not plan to go beyond that. They had ample reasons to do so throughout 2022 with the drastic uptick in assassinations and drone strikes inside their own country and sabotage attacks by the Israelis. So, and the whole time that was happening, of course, sanctions were being expanded, and we've seen just this year the Americans and the Israelis carrying out these huge drills in Israel and in the Mediterranean, practicing bombing Iran, their nuclear program, etc. So they have still not done that, and there hasn't been, at least until earlier this year, an indication that there was any sort of substantive diplomacy going on. But now we know that there are these indirect talks that have been brokered by Muscat that are going on in Oman, related to prisoner swaps and some things like this. But I think the most important one is this interim deal and also it's interesting that the Israelis are willing to, at least tentatively, willing to potentially accept that, because previously, if there was even any discussion at all of returning to the JCPOA, Hanegbi himself has said that multiple times he's said that Netanyahu will 100% attack Iran and start a war. That'll happen basically over Israel's dead body. We're never going back to the JCPOA. And even the so-called anti-establishment candidate, who has a lot of great things to say on certain issues, Robert F. Kennedy Jr., he's not entertaining a return to the JCPOA, which is ludicrous because the only thing wrong with it is the U.S. is no longer in it. Iran can, of course, because of Articles 26 and 36, walk back their commitments, since certainly the Europeans and the Americans have not upheld their obligations as a part of the deal. And of course, all this does is it just takes war off the table. And there's no reason we should be launching an economic war against the Iranian people. It's one of the worst things our government does. So anyway, it'll be interesting to see what comes of that. So this next story from Dave DeCamp on July 19th at antiwar.com, speaking of sanctions enforcement, Iranian oil stolen by the U.S., stuck on a tanker off the coast of Texas. So U.S. federal prosecutors are struggling to sell off a shipment of stolen Iranian oil being carried by a Greek tanker off the coast of Texas. And this comes from the Wall Street Journal on Tuesday. The Justice Department seized the Greek tanker, the Suez Rajan, in April under the pretext of sanctions enforcement and forced the ship to head for Texas instead of China. The Suez Rajan is carrying 800,000 barrels of stolen oil and is currently off the coast at Galveston. Now, according to the Journal, the U.S. can't sell the oil because the companies that would unload the oil are worried about Iranian retaliation in the Persian Gulf. So, a Houston based energy executive involved in the matter told the Wall Street Journal that companies with any exposure whatsoever in the Persian Gulf are literally afraid to do it. The executive said that several companies contacted about the oil declined to unload the cargo. After the U.S. stole the Iranian oil shipment, Iran seized two tankers in the Persian Gulf, which was likely retaliation. Now, since then, the U.S. has announced several measures to increase its military presence in the region and to prevent more Iranian seizures in the Persian Gulf that it provoked in the first place. And the U.S. has a history of seizing these tankers and stealing the Iranian cargo. In 2021, the Biden administration sold off 2 million barrels of Iranian oil from a tanker that was seized off the coast of the United Arab Emirates. And during the Trump administration, the U.S. seized ships carrying Iranian gas bound for Venezuela and discharged some of the cargo in New York. And Kyle has some very important stories that he's written up about escalating tensions in the Middle East, particularly in Syria, between U.S. and Russian aircraft.
Yeah, Connor, I wrote this one July 19th for the Libertarian Institute. American and Russian military aircraft increasingly in dangerous situations over Syria. Washington and Moscow are accusing each other of dangerous and unprofessional military activity in Syria. The Kremlin has issued a series of complaints in the past week that American military aircraft are operating in areas used by civilian airliners. The deputy chief of Russia's Center for Reconciliation and Opposing Parties in Syria said that the American warplanes create a dangerous situation for the civilian aircraft. Additionally, Moscow says American forces stationed at the Altanov garrison, a U.S. military base on the Iraq-Syria border, have used air defenses, further endangering civilian planes. On Tuesday, the Air Force Lieutenant General claimed a Russian fighter jet created an unsafe situation for an American spy plane. He reported the incident occurred Saturday when a U.S. MC-12 conducting operations in support of civilian coalition defeated the ISIS mission was closely approached by a Russian Su-35 against established norms and protocols. He described the Russian fighter jet's actions as a dangerous situation for the Americans on board the spy planes. He said the spy plane was forced to fly through the wake and turbulence. This reduced the crew's ability to safely operate the aircraft and put the crew's 4 members' lives at risk. He said this represents a new level of unsafe and unprofessional behavior by Russian aircraft operating in Syria. The U.S. and Russian militaries have increasingly become confrontational in the skies above Syria. Both countries have operated in Syria since 2015 and have successfully used a deconfliction procedure to largely avoid any altercations. Moscow was invited into Syria by the government in Damascus. Washington invaded Syria under pretense of defeating the Islamic State, a terrorist group that the CIA and American allies armed. After ISIS lost all its territory, U.S. soldiers remained in Syria. In recent months, the Kremlin said American fighter jets are targeting Russian aircraft. Washington has released footage showing 2 Russian fighter jets harassing an American drone. The White House has responded by deploying more military equipment to the Middle East. In June, Washington announced it would send F-22s to the region. Earlier this week, the Department of Defense said it would send F-35s and F-16s to the Middle East to prevent Iran from seizing ships. The Pentagon noted Russia's military activity in Syria when announcing the deployment. So Connor suggesting that that military equipment could also be turned against Moscow in Syria. And with that, let's wrap up the show here today. Connor, thank you so much for coming back on. And everybody, again, please help us out at the Libertarian Institute. We're doing really great work. We're continuing to grow, continuing to build and become a greater and greater institute. I think in the terms of institutes, in the lifespan of institutes, we're still relatively new, Connor, but we're definitely growing, signing, and having huge writers on our team. And again, just a great group of, younger libertarians who Scott Horton has given a platform to really, find their voice in this movement. And so help us continue working and continue to grow and support us at the Libertarian Institute. Thanks, Connor. And thanks to anybody who donates.